Shall we start? Shall we kick off? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, my name is Noam. Anyone who doesn't know me, I'm an academic clinical fellow at CPFT, and it is my absolute pleasure to introduce today's speaker. So today's still virtual lunchtime seminar talk will be given by Professor Sander van der Linden. He's a professor of social psychology in society at the University of Cambridge and the director of the Cambridge Social Decision-Making Laboratory. Professor van der Linden has had many achievements. I do not want to take too much of the time of his talk, just mentioning some of his achievements. So he's ranked among the top 1% social scientists in the world, won various awards, including like the Rising Star Award from APS, and also been featured in the media multiple times. He's co-designed a game that's called Bad News, which I played a little bit with, and I recommend that you try it. It's quite interesting. I can share some of my experience later on in the Q&A. And today he's going to tell us his work on fake news and possible interventions. The title of the talk is called Psychological Inoculation Against Misinformation. Very much looking forward to hearing it. Please take it away.
Yeah, thanks so much for that kind introduction. And can everyone hear me okay and see my screen okay? Is this okay?
Yeah,
good, perfect. Yeah, again, thanks so much for having me. I hope this is going to be useful to a psychiatry audience, but you know, psychology and psychiatry are obviously very, very closely linked. I'll start off by giving you some earlier work that we did in the lab, and then move on to some of the more exciting field interventions that we've been working on to try to counter misinformation. I'll talk about misinformation in different areas, including some health areas and health domains, but I'm happy to answer any questions in the Q&A about any specific use cases that you might be thinking of. I don't have to remind people, of course, here in the UK of some of the consequences of misinformation. In the UK alone, about 50 phone masts have been set on fire because of links between the coronavirus conspiracy theory that 5G masts are exacerbating symptoms of the virus. In Iran, people have ingested methanol and been taken to emergency rooms en masse because of false rumors that there's cures of coronavirus. In the United States, we've seen the COVID will change your RNA campaign fairly widely. One of my favorite examples from the UK is the disappearing needle. So if you get the vaccine, this is a video which purports to show that if you get the vaccine, the needle actually disappears, so it's fake. Now, of course, with the Ukraine conflict, there's been a deluge of Russian disinformation. These are called shallow fakes. So this is a video of a convoy supposedly heading to Ukraine. In fact, this is a train in Southern California that has nothing to do with Ukraine. Putin has put out lots of disinformations about genocide, and it's just been absurd. But I don't want to linger too much on definitions. We can have very long discussions about this, but just for the purpose of this talk, I define misinformation as anything that's incorrect, including simple errors. And so I'm more concerned with disinformation, or the purposeful spread of misinformation, which includes some psychological intent to deceive people, either with a political agenda or not, which is then sometimes referred to as propaganda. But I know that we use the term fake news for all of these things, but I'm more concerned about disinformation. Now, when you look at how people measure individual susceptibility to misinformation in this field, something we also actively work on, what's interesting is that we often use fact-check news articles from places like PolitiFact or PolitiFact, Snopes, there's all of the common sort of fact checkers. I think one key issue with this is that actually the proportion of news that gets fact checked is very small. And so a lot of research is based on this sort of peculiar snapshot of fact check news. Whereas in our lab, in our research group, we have a slightly different definition of misinformation, which is we're kind of looking at information that either uses or doesn't use particular techniques that are used to spread misinformation. So these techniques I'll introduce later, but a really good example is a headline from the Chicago Tribune, which is a very reputable outlet in the United States, that published an article which said, healthy doctor died 2 weeks after receiving COVID vaccine. CDC is investigating why. Now, if you go by sort of the common definitions of a fact checker, I mean, the headline isn't false. The Chicago Tribune is a reputable outlet, so it's not a dodgy publisher. But if you maintain our definition, which is more about are techniques being used to mislead people with a particular headline, then you would definitely characterize this as misinformation in the sense that these events are clearly independent, right? A doctor died 2 weeks after getting the vaccine. Those are facts. But the way that the information is framed to fuel vaccine hesitancy and to get people riled up about the vaccine, that's clearly misleading. And that more gray area is what I'm most interested in, because I think most of the problem is actually this area. And it's not an obscure example. I mean, this story was the most shared story in the first quarter of 2021 on Facebook, in fact. And so I think that's where the real problem is, with the subtle manipulation of news. The stuff that's just overtly false is actually in the minority, as studies have shown and quantified this. Now, if we look at what we can do about this problem, the most common approaches are both fact-checking and debunking, which are not bad, but they have some limitations. So lots of research in cognitive science and social psychology has shown two particular issues that are worth highlighting if you look at meta-analyses of this literature. And the first is something that we call the continued influence of misinformation. So once people are exposed to a falsehood, it is extremely difficult to correct it because people continue to retrieve false details from memory, even when they acknowledge a correction or having seen a fact check. And that's because the misinformation, it settles in our memory networks, it makes friends with other things that you know. And if you look at some of the sort of neurological studies on this, I mean, it's not entirely clear, but either something goes wrong during the retrieval process, so people fail to retrieve the correction, or there's a problem with the integration, that people fail to integrate the correction alongside the misinformation in their memory networks. But I think the bottom line result is the same, is that something's not going right. And so people continue to rely on false information when asked to make inferences about events. The second problem is more practical, is that fact-checking just doesn't scale. It doesn't receive any engagement on social media. The amount of people that are exposed to a fact check is just tiny compared to the viral misinformation and the amount of people that are exposed to the initial misinformation itself. And so fact-checking is important, but its audience is just very limited. And so to try to address this problem, we've been thinking about the idea of pre-bunking or psychological inoculation, which is the opposite of debunking, in that you try to preemptively build resilience against misinformation. And one way to do that is through a framework called psychological inoculation. So Bill McGuire, who was a social psychologist, was very active during the war in the 60s and 70s, Korean War. He was pondering over a problem that pertains to U.S. foreign soldiers being kidnapped and potentially brainwashed by foreign troops. Although he never actually got to it, his idea really was to create what he called a vaccine for brainwash. This is a popular article from Psychology Today from the 60s that I was able to retrieve, where he illustrates some of his early experiments on this. And I think it was a fascinating idea. And his observation was really important. So this was about the Korean War, and that, one British national and 19 US nationals voluntarily stayed behind in communist China at the time. And the US thought that they had been brainwashed. And, we know from later accounts that wasn't exactly true. I mean, there was a lot of racism in America, and some of the soldiers didn't want to go home because of that. But even, assuming that what they thought was true at the time was that they had been brainwashed, McGuire was interested in the government response. And the response was, people don't understand the facts about society. They don't understand the facts about why democracies and capitalism is so great. They don't have the facts at hand. Which is very similar to the situation we're facing now. And McGuire said, no, that's not the right approach. He said that what happened was that the soldiers weren't prepared for the types of attacks that they were exposed to in terms of their beliefs. They were repeatedly exposed to a form of questioning about why they think that capitalism is good, why they're engaging in this war, that they don't have clear reasons, that they don't understand their self-concept, and that their self-concept is tied to this idea of capitalism. It was a very different form of interrogation, and they didn't have any mental defenses. So what Maguire said is that they should have trained these soldiers with weakened doses or simulations of the types of attacks, types of psychological attacks that they would be experiencing. Now, of course, the modern evidence on brainwashing, we know that that's completely unreliable. But at the time, this is what they thought was true. And so Maguire did some of these initial experiments in the lab where he reasoned that it should work exactly like a biological vaccine. So the idea of inoculation theory is that just as you expose people to a weakened dose of a virus to try to trigger the production of antibodies to help confer infection resistance against future infection, you can do the same with information. By preemptively exposing people to a weakened dose of a falsehood, and by preemptively refuting that falsehood, people can build up cognitive or intellectual antibodies against misinformation. And that was really the main idea. And the psychological form of inoculation contains two components. Sometimes this is called an effective component, but the dual process nature of this isn't exactly clear. But the idea is that you have to forewarn people that there are others out there trying to manipulate them. And that's to sort of kickstart the psychological immune system, because otherwise people aren't going to pay attention to whatever you have to say in terms of processing the content. So people need to perceive manipulative intent. This is a very important psychological process for getting people to pay attention. And the cognitive basis, which is sometimes called the reputational preemption, is to preemptively refute falsehoods people will later be exposed to, which we've relabeled as pre-bunking because it's easier for people to understand. Now, Maguire did some of these experiments in completely unrelated contexts. There's some contrived laboratory studies with students about innocuous issues like brushing your teeth is healthy, and trying to persuade people otherwise. And then he dropped this line of investigation in the 60s, never to be heard of again. And so we thought it'd be so relevant and interesting to pick this up now that we know that we can actually use models from epidemiology to study how misinformation spreads. And so the only natural response really seems to be to try to inoculate people. And so I think if he was still alive today, hopefully he would have an interest in seeing how this theory could be applied. So we did this first experiment, and the news was kind of who Cambridge scientists consider fake news vaccine. One journalist called us and asked if this was fake news. I'll show you the evidence, and you can make up your mind as to whether this is credible or not. So here the idea was actually to replicate Maguire's core paradigm that he did in the 60s in the context of a real issue about which there's been a lot of misinformation, which was climate change at the time. There's a wonderful documentary on this called Merchants of Doubt, which is really about how techniques that are used by industry actors, including the tobacco industry and the fossil fuel industry, they've used, and this piqued my interest initially many years ago. This study's pretty old now, it's more than 7 years ago, but it initially piqued my interest because it became clear to me that certain actors were recycling the same disinformation techniques, which is to cast doubt on the science, on the scientific consensus, whether it's between smoking and disease, fossil fuels and climate change, acid rain, any of these issues. And so some of these techniques that they use, this is called the fake expert technique. They would run ads, and more doctors smoke Camel than any other cigarette. And they would do the same things. They would pay people to sort of dress up in white coats. This was called the white coat tactic, to try to convince people. They've written to the Bush administration at the time that they should convince people that there is no consensus about global warming. This was a leaked memo. And so the question for us was, okay, let's do an experiment, very controlled, see what happens. And so this is about 2,000 people online. We asked people to estimate the consensus on lots of different issues, so they didn't know that it was an experiment about climate change. This is their pre-post shift in the estimates of the scientific consensus. So in one condition, we just expose people to the facts about climate change, which is that 97% of climate scientists agree that it's real. Now, in that condition, people update their beliefs towards the facts, which is kind of unsurprising. But a lot of people might say, okay, that's not reality. People don't update their beliefs in a vacuum where they're just exposed to facts. If only that were our reality today, but it's not. And so that's a good point. So this is about 20 percentage points, which we ask people on a scale of 0 to 100. And the actual, their estimate tends to be around 50% because of the long-standing false media balance around climate change, where they would probably, they would present both an expert and a contrarian. Even the BBC did this, and so hugely problematic. Now, then we showed participants this website. This is a real website claiming that thousands of Americans have signed this petition, saying that climate change isn't real. And then we find that people are duped by that, because now they think that thousands of scientists say that that there is no consensus on climate change. It works the same on vaccines and COVID and things like that. When you show people side by side, like the stuff you see in the media often, like, vaccines are safe, but here's a story from one particular parent who had a nasty experience. What you see then is that it completely wipes out the power of facts completely. So introducing any contrarian information just wipes out this positive effect of the facts nullified. So that was very concerning. I mean, now we know that misinformation has consequences, but this was 7 years ago, and we're still trying to figure this out. The key for me, though, was whether we could inoculate and protect people from these types of attacks. So we had two conditions. One was the simple forewarning, where we could have told people that there's actors out there trying to manipulate them on this issue and that they shouldn't buy into it. And the detailed vaccine included the detailed preemptive refutation, which was that you might see a petition somewhere. However, you should know that this is the fake expert technique. People on this petition include Dr. Gary Hallowell, who is a member of the Spice Girls, Charles Darwin, and so on. So this petition is bogus. It has lots of bogus people on it. And so what happened was that, if you inoculated people in advance, I wanted to see how, what the marginal benefit is of a detailed kind of preemptive refutation. Turns out there was a lot of benefit to it. So this is about 1/3 and 2/3 of the original effect of the fact. So not full immunity, but you could, immunize people to a pretty good extent using this technique in the lab. And this was true for, whether you were Republican or Democrat or independent. In the US, it's very polarizing. And so even for people who might have had the quote unquote, wrong attitude at the beginning, we were still able to neutralize further attempts to dupe them. So that was quite positive. And we pre-registered and repeated this experiment a few years later. The only change really we made was that we delayed the misinformation attack, as we call it in this literature. Sounds a bit nefarious, but basically by 1 week. So we inoculated people at T1, and then 1 week later, we attacked them with the misinformation to see if the inoculation would still last. And basically, this is at the beginning. So you expose people to the fact that most scientists agree, as well as the inoculation. And then everything's positive here because you're boosting people's knowledge of and perception of the science and the facts. And then a week later, people are attacked. And you can see here that in the inoculation condition, not only is it higher than the false balance in the control condition, but it's about the same point as the consensus condition. So it's interesting because remember that in the consensus condition, people weren't showing any misinformation at any point. This is just a facts-only condition. But the facts themselves decay naturally over time. 1 week later, the effect is reduced by 50%. So people forget about facts naturally. But the interesting thing is that if you had inoculated people and then exposed them to misinformation, they actually end up at the same point as they would have anyway, because facts kind of naturally seem to dissipate from our memories. And so there was no decay within the course of a week. Now, we've written numerous reviews about how to apply inoculation in this context recently. And I really didn't want to linger too much on these older findings, but they formed the basis of two important questions. One was, okay, well, this is nice, but a lot of journalists asked us, how could you pre-bunk every single story? It kind of has the same problem as fact-checking in a way, that how do you scale this idea of pre-bunking? And two, how could you do this in a way that also engages people in an interesting way, because science just has a yawn factor on many people. So we took some inspiration from Professor Severus Snape from the Harry Potter novels, who said, your defenses must be as flexible and inventive as the arts that you seek to undo. And so John Rosenbeek, who is a British Academy postdoctoral fellow at the moment here, had the brilliant idea of gamifying this. And so we teamed up with a media literacy organization, and we created an app called Bad News. Bad News is a fully fledged social media simulation. In the simulation, people are not only forewarned about the dangers of fake news, but we expose them to weakened doses of the techniques that are used to spread misinformation. And through that process, people can build up internal refutations and figure out how it works, and so build resilience against these techniques. This is what we call active inoculation. So passive inoculation is really the idea that I give you the counter arguments that you can use when attacked later on by somebody else. You have to kind of passively read and remember it. Whereas we thought, everything we know about experiential learning and the power of agency and people having control over their own ideas is what if people could actively generate their own antibodies? And that's going to be much more interesting and effective. And that was really the basis behind this sort of active perspective taking experience. The threat element of inoculation, again, the idea that there's actors out there trying to manipulate you is activated by letting people step into the shoes of a disinformation producer. And that's kind of the edgy element of it, that we let people step into the shoes of the bad guy in a very controlled way so that we can administer these sort of weekend doses. So you can see John Rosenbeek on CNN, who was not so pleased with some of the questions that he got. But how does it work? So this was done during the Trump presidency, so we've updated the game. But your aim is to gain as many followers as possible without losing any credibility. So if you're being too ridiculous, then you lose all credibility, because a real misinformation actor uses clever techniques. They're not just fooling around, and that's really the idea. So here you step into the shoes of Donald Trump. After long deliberation with my generals, I've decided to declare war on North Korea, #Kim Jong-un. And so, you tweet this, you gain followers. It's a very active experience. You create your own hashtag, you trend. So mainstream media, one massive conspiracy, #fake news. Here you're impersonating NASA. So here the idea is that most people on our pretest don't actually notice that we've manipulated Trump's Twitter handle. The same with NASA. Large space objects have hit U.S. West Coast, #be safe. And so this is part of what we call the impersonation technique. So it turns out, when we looked at the literature, fake experts are just one example of this larger idea of impersonating accounts, public health authorities, and so on. And so we started building out these larger techniques that we're inoculating people against. And the idea here is really that one of scalability. And so the idea is that, well, instead of trying to inoculate people against specific myths one at a time, what if you could inoculate people against the larger overarching strategies that are used to produce most misinformation? And then if we test people with just a battery of specific fake news, have people been inoculated regardless of what the specific content is, as long as it belongs to the specific technique? So it's kind of like a broad spectrum vaccine, right? The idea is that you vaccinate people against one strain, and then they have immunity against all variants, at least within that particular sort of area, right? Not a totally different virus, but different instances, variations of the same virus. So we have polarization, polarizing people, impersonating other people, conspiracy theories, trolling people, using emotions like fear-mongering and outrage to get people riled up, and discrediting actors, your fake news. Not saying that these are the only techniques, but these are very, very common. In the game, everything's fictional, but it's based on real world events. So the Trump example is actually based on somebody impersonating Warren Buffett. And so he got hundreds of thousands of followers within minutes. And he was tweeting out things like, oh, invest in what makes you happy, total nonsense. But that's kind of striking a balance between avoiding familiarity and memory confounds with content people could have seen before, and keeping it ecologically valid, in the sense that, this simulates social media, and it's based on real world events, but we can still control the content in a very pure sense. So we test people in the game with a very simple within subject experiment. We expose people to examples that use this technique that people haven't seen before, and we ask people how reliable they find it. So you can see this was during Game of Thrones. Total fake news, #Game of Thrones will be postponed to a salary dispute. I'm not sure if you watched Game of Thrones, but ending was very disappointing to me. Anyway, so we update these items regularly, obviously. Here's Leo DiCaprio, snow and freezing in New York. Could do something like global warming you're always going on about. This is Johnson crude oil. This is part of the trolling technique. So we're not having the simplistic idea of telling people what's right or wrong, but calibrating people's judgments as to whether they can detect content in terms of whether a manipulation technique is being used so that they can adjust their reliability ratings. So this thing went viral. We got hundreds of thousands of people go through the intervention, which allowed us to do some testing. We had about 30,000 data points of 15,000 completed pre-post pairs during the first few months. And so we published an initial evaluation of this. So you can see here for real news that doesn't use any of these techniques, people find it highly reliable before and after playing. But for the fake news items that make use of these techniques, people find them significantly less reliable after playing. These are the data distribution, so the whole thing sort of shifts down. Didn't really matter if you were left, right, young, old, lower, higher educated. I mean, people had different levels of initial susceptibility, but the intervention effect was actually pretty stable. I mean, there was some minor variation here and there, but really nothing to write home about. Now, obviously, there's limitations to within subject design. So Melissa, who's a Gates scholar in our lab and in the department, did a randomized replication of bad news with a gamified control group this time, Tetris. So we wanted to control for people playing a game and have a randomized design. Also, the game engine's really slowed down by asking people questions, and so we can't really do much within the engine. And so we created a Java plugin so that we can use it in Qualtrics in a survey environment and ask people more questions and include more test items. So we had about 3 test items now for every technique. So there's 6 techniques. So we had a battery of 18 fake items, and that was our index here as our dependent variable. But Melissa had this really interesting idea, and she said, well, wouldn't it be interesting if the game also boosted people's confidence? Because if you're not very confident in what you believe or your ability to discern fact from fiction, you're going to be easily persuaded. And so that's really also what we found. So this is, again, these are the average of the 18 items. These are the data distributions. People who played the bad news game found fake news significantly less reliable on average, pretty decent effect size. But we also boosted people's confidence in their own judgments. And importantly, only when they updated in the right direction. And so that was an important finding as well. Raccoon, who's a final year PhD student in our lab, did another pre-registered replication, and he was really interested in the decay of this intervention. And his PhD is really about trying to figure out what drives the longevity of interventions and resistance to persuasion. Because one of the questions we kept getting was, okay, interesting, you can inoculate people against these techniques, but how long does it last? And so, if it only lasts for a few seconds, then how useful is it? And so that obviously was a good question. So we decided to look at the long-term effectiveness of this approach. It's always the same experiments. I'll explain it once, and then the others are pretty much the same. So we pre-test people based on this battery of 18 items. We randomize people to either inoculation or control. We test them again, and then we decided to follow up with people week after week after week for a period of about 2 months. In the second experiment, everything was the same, but we cut out all of the intermediate testing. We just followed up with people at the end. And in the third experiment, we changed the test items at every testing round. One of the reviewers was like, oh, maybe people have memorized the items. I mean, I don't know. I can barely remember what happened for dinner. But let's assume that people memorized their responses to 18 items every single time, just to make sure that that's not a confound. So what you see, and by the way, everything's available on the OSF, our data intervention scripts, if anyone wants to have a look and play around. Again, we see the effect of the intervention here. People found fake news less reliable. The whole distribution shifts to the left, which is less reliable. But it stayed like that week after week after week. And so, I told Raccoon, I mean, this is impossible. Even the COVID vaccine wanes over time, right? We need boosters. And so something else is going on here. And so this became clear in our second experiment, where we found that if at the end, you can see here that even though there's still a significant intervention effect between treatment and control, it actually, people found fake news more reliable again over time. So we can see decay setting in here. And so what we concluded from this, and later also tested, was that we were actually boosting people by engaging them on a weekly basis with not only the threat of fake news, but also retrieving maybe some of the lessons they have learned. And in later research, what we've actually found was that you can boost people in 2 different ways, either through motivation or through memory. So people need to stay motivated to want to defend themselves from misinformation, but they also need to be able to retrieve the right information from memory to resist the misinformation sort of attacks. And of course, if you're more motivated, you're going to be more likely to want to retrieve and remember things. And so we found that those are 2 crucial mechanisms for inoculation. If people are interested in testing and item effects, we have a measurement paper on this as well. But by this time, we were accumulating lots of evidence, and we started to team up with the government and the Foreign Commonwealth Office, who translated this intervention into every major language in the world by now, so we could do large-scale cross-cultural trials with the simple within-subject design in the game. So we found similar effects in Sweden, for example. We did a paper on Germany, Greece, and Poland. There is some cultural heterogeneity, but it's small, at least in the West. We've done some trials in India and elsewhere where we found quite different results, but at least it's been pretty stable in European and North America, Australia, and the Commonwealth sort of countries. We just have an article came out this week on trying to extend the metaphor. So one of the things we were looking at was cross protection, for example. So if you've been inoculated against one particular technique, and we show you a range of misinformation that makes use of not only that technique, but also others against which you hadn't been inoculated, is there what we call cross protection? The answer is yes, but at a much reduced effect size. And so, the effect size is about 50% less, but, this is to be expected. But it's a positive sort of side effect that even if you've only been inoculated against one technique, there seems to be some cross protection against related techniques, so people find fake news less reliable. And again, no difference for real news. We published a handbook for NATO on how to use this in strategic communications, obviously very relevant now with the Ukraine conflict. What's interesting actually is that US intelligence used the pre-bunking approach to warn the public before Russia's invasion that they would be exposed to propaganda videos. They explained the techniques, that the shallow fakes and how they work, that they would be seeing Ukrainian soldiers supposedly on Russian soil. And they tried to inoculate people, and they speculate that it could have delayed the attack by a few days because they sort of thwarted Putin's plan. Obviously, I don't know how much you can expect from the social science intervention, but I would say even if they delayed it by a few days, that's probably a success. I don't think you could really expect anything more. But what I like here is that we have a living intervention. So John Rosenbeek, who also happens to has done his PhD on the Donbass conflict and speaks Russian, amongst one of his many skills. We have a version in Russian in Ukraine, and so we can test it there as well. So we find very similar effects in terms of people's resilience to misinformation. We can adapt it to new contexts, and so that's been really interesting. So here's some of the headlines about the conflict. Actor Steven Seagal spotted among Russian special forces. I mean, this is a real headline that's been fact checked. And so, we were in the London Design Museum for a while. Not because of the science, but the artists that produced the game did it in a very cool way. And so we received some awards, and John very deservedly received a prize. We've done a version for kids. And in the remaining time that I have, and we can leave the rest for discussion, I just want to show you one or two real-world applications of where we went with this. So during the pandemic, we teamed up with the Cabinet Office when they were thinking about how to best counter misinformation at the start of the pandemic. And, again, one of the approaches was fact-checking and debunking. And so we explained to them that a proactive strategy to try to build societal resilience against misinformation could be more effective. And one of the feedbacks, or some of the feedback we've gotten about that news, was that it's great, but it takes 15 to 20 minutes, which is not something that they can scale on social media. And that was an important point for us, right? That not everyone wants to play a 20-minute game. So we created Go Viral, which is a 5-minute version, only has 3 levels, and it targets the most common techniques used to spread misinfo about COVID-19, which includes conspiracy theories, from Bill Gates and changing your RNA all the way to 5G, as well as fake experts, so fake doctors, fake nurses, impersonating public health officials, and the use of emotions to get people worried about the vaccine and lockdowns and things like that. We were lucky to be able to partner with the United Nations and the World Health Organization on this, who could really spread this intervention and target it at audiences who are most susceptible to misinformation. You can find more about Go Viral on the World Health Organization page. It works the same as bad news. It uses the same level of sarcasm and humor to create these sort of weakened doses. Again, so we're not duping people with any actual misinformation, right? It's just that we make it so that we trigger people's interest in learning about these techniques. Here you have Joel, oh, how needed 4 and Teeny, or 5, it was the start of the pandemic, everyone's in lockdown, but the internet still works. So you join a group called Not Co-Afraid, and you start spreading information that global NGOs are covering up that eating kiwis actually cures the virus. So this is obviously ridiculous, but it's based on, again, on real world sort of scenarios. University of Camford expert, lizard people behind coronavirus outbreak, live virus particles found in terrariums. So this is, part of the fake expert technique. So the way we evaluate these interventions now is both in the wild. So we have our pre-post design where we get large scale big data on very precise but biased within subject designs, as well as pre-registered RCTs that we conducted in parallel in 3 countries, in the UK, France, and Germany, as well as a 1-week follow-up. What was interesting about this design is that we could include a passive control. It wasn't a perfect control because it was a different intervention, but the United Nations was doing their own pre-bunking campaign on social media using infographics, which again is great, but it's passive. People have to read and remember it, whereas our game is active. But it was an interesting sort of control. So we test people. So here, Nobel laureate professor claims the virus is not natural. There's evidence suggesting it's man-made. How manipulative do you find this post? Again, we're trying to calibrate people's judgments. So we recently published a paper on these data. This is from the in-game. So overall, people find fake news more manipulative after playing, both for the fake expert, the emotion and conspiracy technique. Nothing going on here for real factual news. But again, you can see that most people find it manipulative because this is an opt-in sample, right? So that's why we also do our randomized trials, where you can see here compared to T1, this is go viral, this is the game condition. People find fake news more manipulative. It stayed that way for at least 1 week, so there was no decay. But the UN infographics were also effective in and of themselves, but they were less effective than the go viral intervention, presumably because it's active. I'll come back to that in a second. There was a secular trend in the control group, which we don't know why that happened. Could be repeated testing of some sort, but even controlling for that trend, these were still quite significant. If you look at some of the mechanisms, we indeed find that people in our go viral game experience more motivation to want to defend themselves from fake news than people in the other conditions, and they were also more willing to share the intervention. And that's really crucial because where we're going now is actually spreading the vaccine from one individual to another in online networks. And so that's really an important component. We did one with the US government during the last election, again called Harmony Square, with the Department of Homeland Security to try to secure the integrity of the elections by inoculating people against foreign influence attempts. So this one's very much focused on the technique of trolling and people pretending to be, in this case, Americans, to try to sow divisions, especially racial divisions around elections. This was done with Chris Krebs before he got fired by Trump for continually debunking Trump's election claims. But luckily, they still launched their intervention before he was gone. So this has a newscaster, and you have live ratings, and as you spread misinformation, the ratings change. And so we're also trying to show people the consequences of some of this stuff. And then again, we test them with real world content. Fathers don't deserve a day and Father's Day. The sort of stuff you see on Facebook that's very polarizing. This one was a Trump supporter accidentally got killed in a hunting accident, but somebody commented 1.5 less MAGA Billies in the world. Very polarizing stuff, right? And so again, we find compared to our control, people find this stuff less reliable. They're more confident and less willing to share it with others in their social network. And so we've been talking with the UN. Again, I'd like to show some mock shots of John about not that this is some magical cure, but just to get policymakers thinking about proactive approaches, not only reactive approaches. And as I said before, we're looking at the spread at the moment. We've done some agent-based modeling to try to understand how inoculation could spread in networks. And now we've started to team up with social media companies and technology companies like Google. And one of the interesting things that Google told us was that we need to diversify our vaccines. And so not everyone wants a game. And so maybe we should do videos. And so one of the things we've done now is create videos. They're animated videos. They're not as active, but they're still, we attempt to make them fun and interesting. They use a script, an inoculation script. So the warning that you may be targeted, the microdose, and then ways to refute these attacks in the future. And our website, Inoculation About Science, includes all these videos, all the games, all the papers for people who are interested. These videos are about 1 minute to 30 seconds for deployment on YouTube. Remember, Google owns YouTube. And so one of the things that we've really tried to do is actually test this in the wild. And so Google facilitated an opportunity with YouTube for us to actually test this. And so one of the ideas was that the YouTube algorithm can identify with some probability of what video might be harmful, and then it could automatically inject the inoculation video beforehand in the ad space. You know, these ads on YouTube, they're annoying that you can't skip. So that could be, one of our pre-bunks. And so people were exposed to about one of our videos, about 1 million people, and then YouTube let us randomly select 30% of those for a 1-item question. We weren't allowed to do more. And so we asked people if they could recognize the technique that a particular item demonstrates that they had been inoculated against prior in the video. And they were surveyed within 24 hours of being exposed to our video. And so on YouTube, things are slightly different because it's not headlines that spread, but it's things like political gurus who use rhetorical strategies to facilitate extremist ideologies in people, and they use things like false dichotomies. You're either either join ISIS or you're against Islam, things like that. And so we train people to recognize these strategies. So we used different items for the same technique, just so we can be sure that it's not a single item. The first item didn't work, but the rest did, also for the emotion and the false dichotomy techniques. So on average, there was about a 5% boost in technique recognition, which is a lot smaller than what we see in the lab. But according to YouTube's calculations, that's pretty good for what they see for ads, for example. And so if you scale this across billions of people, YouTube was pretty optimistic that this could be quite useful. Twitter is now pre-bunking. We're doing a campaign with Twitter soon on these videos, actually using Twitter Moments. Here's a review paper for people who are interested in this space more generally, and I hope it was useful. Happy to answer some questions.
Thank you very much. That was fantastic.